I can still feel the chill of the cell even now, the damp air clinging to my skin like the memory of that day. The guards have long stopped speaking to me, and the silence here has its own weight, heavy, patient, almost human. I have little left but time, and time is a cruel companion. It lets a man relive his own mistakes in perfect clarity. For me, that journey always returns to one date, March 17th, 1943, the day the war ended, though no one else could see it yet. I was still Admiral Wilhelm Canaris then, head of the Abwehr, the intelligence service of the German armed forces. Outside my window, Berlin carried on with the illusion of victory, flags, marches, speeches. Inside my office, buried beneath layers of classified reports, a single sheet of paper waited for me. One page, a few numbers. Yet it carried more destruction than 1,000 bombs. It spoke of an American factory, an ocean away, capable, soon, of producing a 4-engine heavy bomber every 60 minutes. I remember reading that line again and again, thinking there must be a mistake. But deep down, I knew there wasn't. That paper was no enemy propaganda. It was the arithmetic of our defeat, written with perfect precision. I have seen many forms of death in this war, bodies, cities, armies, but nothing as cold as that truth. You see, when a man leads an empire built on arrogance, the truth itself becomes treason. I tried to deliver it, but truth in the Reich was like oxygen in a sealed room, necessary and deadly. In the months that followed, I would watch that single page consume everything I believed in. And now, as I wait for the footsteps outside this cell, I understand. I was never executed for betrayal. I was executed for being right. I was not born a spy. I was a naval officer, raised by the discipline of the sea, by the smell of salt and diesel, and by the unbending rules of the old Imperial Navy. Honor, duty, precision, those were the pillars of my life, long before politics began to corrupt them. I had served under the Kaiser and watched the German Empire collapse into chaos. I believed that one day Germany could rise again, not through fury or ideology, but through logic, order, and intellect. When Hitler came to power, I convinced myself that serving him was serving my country. It was a dangerous illusion. In 1935, I was appointed head of the Abwehr, the intelligence service of the German armed forces. On paper, my mission was clear: collect information, anticipate the enemy, protect the Reich. In truth, it was a labyrinth of deceit and shifting loyalties. My agents were scattered across the world: Stockholm, Lisbon, Madrid, Ankara, Buenos Aires. They worked quietly, in hotel rooms, embassies, and back rooms of cafes. They listened to engineers and diplomats, businessmen and soldiers. From them, I received fragments of truth, small pieces of a vast puzzle that no one else cared to assemble. Through their reports, I began to see the real shape of the war. It was not a clash of soldiers. It was a contest of industries: steel, oil, aluminum, and men. Whoever could produce more would win. Still, I clung to the belief that if I could present the facts clearly, reason would prevail. I trusted in numbers more than ideology. But in Berlin, reason was a dying language. Inside the marble corridors of the Reich Chancellery, truth was not a tool of power, it was an inconvenience. My warnings were trimmed, softened, or buried under propaganda. Bad news was treated as defeatism. In the Führer's circle, optimism was mandatory, and reality was treason. I remember standing before a massive map of Europe, red pins for our victories, black pins for our losses. The red outnumbered the black, yet my eyes always went to the small stack of papers on my desk. Tables of production, fuel consumption, aircraft losses. Those numbers spoke louder than any speech. They told a story that few wanted to read. I began to realize that the Abwehr, my Abwehr, was becoming an island of reality in a sea of delusion. I often wondered if our true enemy was not the Allies, but our own blindness. Still, I kept my composure. Discipline is the last refuge of a soldier when truth becomes dangerous. I told myself that my loyalty was to Germany, not to the man who claimed to embody it. The Germany I loved was not built on hate. It was the land of Bach and Goethe, of engineers and thinkers, of men who measured before they spoke. That Germany was vanishing, replaced by shouts and symbols. I wanted to preserve what remained, even if it meant serving among those who were destroying it. I believed that knowledge could still save us, that if I continued gathering facts, real, cold, mathematical facts, someone, somewhere in power, would finally listen. Perhaps that was my greatest mistake, thinking that truth could change minds already closed. Yet, I kept going, because a man like me, trained by the sea, understands one thing: when the storm comes, you do not abandon the helm. You hold your course until the very end. The first whispers reached me through the gray channels of neutrality, soft, uncertain, and easy to dismiss. A coded message from Stockholm spoke of an American factory unlike any other, so vast that it was said to have its own weather. At first, I thought it was a metaphor, a poetic exaggeration from an overzealous agent. But a week later, a report from Madrid mentioned the same thing. A plant somewhere in Michigan that had begun building heavy bombers using automobile assembly techniques. That was when I started to pay attention. Our agents in neutral countries were often our most reliable eyes. They moved among diplomats, businessmen, engineers, and spies of every flag. In the salons of Lisbon or the cafes of Zurich, they listened to what men let slip after a glass of wine or an indiscreet boast. These fragments, harmless on their own, began to form a pattern. A Swedish engineer who had toured American plants wrote in detail about a new facility, commissioned by the Ford Motor Company. It was designed to mass-produce the B-24 Liberator, a four-engine heavy bomber that weighed over 18 tons and contained more than 1.5 million parts. He described a moving assembly line so large that aircraft were rotated on turntables to make a 90-degree turn midway through the process. The report seemed absurd. Even our finest factories in Germany took weeks, sometimes months, to complete a single bomber like the Heinkel He-127. The idea of building one every hour was madness, or genius beyond our comprehension. In the smoke-filled office of the Abwehr, I read each message twice, then 3 times, as if repetition could make the impossible credible. My analysts were divided. Some dismissed the claims as Allied propaganda meant to intimidate us after Stalingrad. Others, those who had seen American industry before the war, looked uneasy. One of them said quietly, "Herr Admiral, if these numbers are true, the war is already over." I did not answer. I merely nodded and filed the report into the drawer marked Strategic Industrial Developments, United States. I wanted confirmation. For weeks I ordered cross-checks from multiple stations: Bern, Stockholm, Madrid, Ankara. The same story kept returning, like an echo from across the Atlantic. An industrial giant was awakening. What unsettled me most was not the scale itself, but the method, the use of untrained civilians, women, even factory workers with little education, all producing weapons with machine-like precision. It contradicted everything we believed about discipline and hierarchy. Yet the numbers were too consistent to ignore. Slowly, doubt turned to curiosity, and curiosity to fear. Something enormous was taking shape in America, and the winds of that creation were already blowing toward Berlin. All the reports, scattered and uncertain at first, began to converge on a single name: Willow Run. It appeared again and again, whispered through cables from Stockholm, Bern, and Madrid, like the refrain of an approaching storm. The Ford Motor Company had built it on a stretch of Michigan farmland, a plant so vast that one of my agents called it the most enormous room in the history of man. The main assembly line ran for more than half a mile, turning sharply midway to avoid a county tax line. A strange detail, but one that made every report identical. That was how I knew the intelligence was real. The numbers were staggering. 42,000 workers, nearly a third of them women, with shifts running day and night. 9% were African American, 3% classified as disabled, yet all of them worked side by side, producing the same machine, the B-24 Liberator, an 18-ton heavy bomber with more than 1.5 million parts. The goal: one finished aircraft every 60 minutes. I sat in my office, a pencil in hand, and did the arithmetic myself. One bomber per hour meant 24 a day, over 700 a month, from a single factory. At that time, the entire German aircraft industry, with all its Aryan genius, could not match half that output. Even if the Americans reached half their target, the consequences were catastrophic. I remember staring at the map on my wall, at the tiny black crosses marking Allied airfields across England, and feeling a chill that no winter could explain. My analysts fell silent when I shared the figures. Some simply shook their heads, others laughed nervously, but I saw in their eyes the same realization I felt. This was not rumor or propaganda. It was mathematics, and mathematics has no mercy. A report from our Japanese allies confirmed it independently. Their naval attaché in Washington wrote that American production had become an avalanche beyond comprehension. I believed him. The Abwehr's own sources in Detroit described an industrial rhythm so relentless that even the American press could barely keep up with its growth. The more I read, the more I understood that Germany was not fighting an army. It was fighting a factory. The war we imagined, of courage, strategy, and command, was already obsolete. What loomed over us now was a machine war, driven by people who believed in quantity as a form of victory. I put down my pencil and whispered to myself, if these numbers are true, then Germany has already lost. It was not despair I felt, but a kind of cold clarity. The enemy had revealed its greatest weapon, and it was not a bomb or a gun. It was the assembly line. The room smelled of tobacco, paper, and stale confidence. Thick curtains kept out the daylight, trapping the yellow glow of the lamps that hung over the table. Maps covered every wall, Europe cut into grids of conquest and loss, red strings marking divisions, blue pins tracing supply routes that already existed only in theory. I stood at the far end of the table, the Willow Run report in my hand. The officers gathered before me were men hardened by victory, men who had learned to measure truth by the distance of their own ambition. Their uniforms were immaculate, their faces unreadable. Somewhere in the corner, a typewriter clattered, its rhythm sharp and mechanical, filling the pauses where courage should have spoken. I began reading. I told them of the Ford plant in Michigan, half a mile of machinery, 42,000 workers, one bomber every hour. No adjectives, no opinions, only numbers. The sound of the typewriter stopped. For a moment, even the smoke in the air seemed to hold still. One general shifted in his chair. Another gave a faint snort, the kind of laugh that hides discomfort. "Impossible," someone murmured. "American exaggeration." I expected that reaction. Propaganda was always easier to believe when it favored us. I laid the paper flat on the table, pointing to the verified details, production schedules, aerial reconnaissance from our agents, reports cross-checked from 4 neutral capitals. Still, no one spoke. I could feel their doubt pressing against me like a weight. At last, Field Marshal Keitel broke the silence. "Herr Admiral," he said, "even if this plant exists, it changes nothing. The German spirit cannot be measured in machines." His words hung in the air, warm and empty. I met his gaze and nodded. There was nothing else to say. Around us, the map of Europe glowed red under the lamps, the color of victories already fading. One of my aides gathered the papers, his hands trembling slightly. As I watched the officers disperse, I realized that I had not presented intelligence. I had delivered heresy. The numbers were too cold, too clean, too absolute. They didn't fit into speeches or dreams. Outside, somewhere beyond the walls of that smoke-filled room, The industrial heartbeat of America was already thundering. But in Berlin, the only sound was the rustle of uniforms and the soft, stubborn scrape of denial. Reichsmarschall Goering received me in his usual theater of excess. His office in the Air Ministry was more a stage than a workplace. Thick carpets, gold-framed paintings, the sweet sour scent of cigars that cost more than a soldier's monthly pay. He sat behind a desk the size of a dining table, his uniform straining at the seams, a diamond-studded baton resting beside a crystal ashtray. When I entered, he greeted me with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, Canaris," he said, "our man of secrets. What gloomy prophecy do you bring today?" I handed him the Willow Run report. He skimmed the first page, then leaned back and laughed. A great rolling laugh that filled the room like smoke. "Americans," he said between bursts of amusement, "they build refrigerators and razor blades, not airplanes." The other officers in the room chuckled obediently. It was the laughter of men who needed to believe in their own invincibility. I stood still, watching him. Goering's rings caught the light as he waved the paper dismissively. "You intelligence men are too easily frightened by numbers," he continued. "Machines don't win wars, men do, German men." He tapped his chest as if patriotism alone could replace fuel or aluminum. I spoke carefully, reminding him that our own factories were already running below capacity, that Allied bombing was increasing, that even if the Americans reached half of these figures, their output would eclipse ours. His smile froze for a moment, then returned, harder now. "Nonsense," he said. "You sound like one of those pessimists from the General Staff. Perhaps you should spend less time counting and more time believing." The words landed like a slap, but I didn't respond. Around us, the air felt thick, suffocating. The room reeked of luxury and decay, of a man who mistook indulgence for power. Goering turned to his aides. "File this with the other fairy tales," he said. "I prefer facts." They laughed again. Facts, I thought. That word had lost its meaning here. The Reichsmarschall puffed on his cigar, sending gray coils into the air like smoke signals from a sinking ship. I realized then that I wasn't speaking to a commander. I was speaking to a myth, wrapped in silk and denial. When the meeting ended, I gathered the unused pages and slipped them back into my briefcase. Goering was still laughing as I saluted and turned to leave. The sound followed me into the corridor, echoing off marble and brass. It was a laughter too loud, too desperate, the laughter of a man drowning beneath his own illusions. As I stepped out into the cold air, I knew with certainty the truth had just been shot down, and no one had needed a gun. The train to East Prussia cut through a landscape of ice and silence. The windows were rimed with frost, the forests outside standing like black spears against the snow. I kept the Willow Run report inside my briefcase, bound in leather as if the weight of the truth required a coffin of its own. Every mile closer to the wolf's lair felt like descending deeper into something alive, an organism made of paranoia and power. The closer you came, the more the air itself seemed to harden. At the last station, we changed to a convoy of black staff cars. Soldiers in white camouflage lined the forest road, their rifles glinting under the pale light. The checkpoint barriers rose and fell like the slow, rhythmic pulse of a creature guarding its heart. No one spoke. The tires crunched over frozen gravel, and somewhere in the distance, dogs barked. When we entered the outer compound, I caught the first glimpse of the Führer's headquarters, bunkers half buried in snow, radio antennas jutting up like broken bones. The air smelled of diesel, pine, and fear. Each gate led to another, narrower than before. Papers were checked, signatures verified, orders repeated twice in whispers. Even the guards looked afraid, though none would admit it. Inside, the temperature dropped further. I felt it not just in my hands, but in my stomach, as though the cold had learned to creep through thought itself. The corridors were lined with maps, photos, and slogans, a geography of delusion wrapped in concrete. I thought of how far this fortress was from the world it tried to command, far from Berlin's chaos, far from the truth that was slowly closing in from every direction. I imagined the meeting to come. I would hand the report to the man whose will had replaced reason, whose belief in destiny made him blind to arithmetic. I knew I would be walking into a chamber where facts were flammable. As our car rolled to a stop before the final bunker, snow began to fall again, soft, endless, indifferent. I looked up at the gray sky and realized that even the weather here seemed staged, as if nature itself were under orders. A sentry opened my door. "Herr Admiral," he said, voice low and uncertain. I nodded, stepped out, and felt the snow crush beneath my boots. Ahead lay the wolf's lair, and for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to walk willingly into the belly of a beast. The air inside the conference room was dense and sour, heavy with smoke and tension. The Führer sat at the head of the table, flanked by his ministers like statues guarding a shrine. His eyes, pale and restless, darted between the papers before him. I placed the Willow Run report on the polished wood, the pages trembling slightly under my hand. "My Führer," I began, "this information comes from multiple verified sources. It concerns an American factory capable of producing a 4-engine heavy bomber, one every hour." The words felt fragile against the silence. Hitler's gaze lifted slowly, fixing on me with a glare that could have frozen water. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then his voice came, sharp and rising. "Lies," he hissed. "Jewish lies. American propaganda designed to break our spirit." His hand slammed down on the table, rattling the glasses. "You, Canaris, you of all people, should know better than to believe such nonsense." The outburst echoed through the bunker like artillery. I did not flinch. "My Führer," I said quietly, "these figures are confirmed by our own agents and by our allies in Japan. Even a fraction of their output would—" "Enough!" he roared. "I will not hear it." His face flushed red, veins standing at his temples. Around him, no one dared breathe. Albert Speer, sitting to my left, stared at the table, his hands folded, lips pressed thin. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The silence was an admission. Hitler's anger shifted from me to the papers, as though the ink itself had betrayed him. "Do you take me for a fool, Admiral?" he spat. "Do you think I do not know the strength of the German people? We will outlast them by will alone." I realized then that I was not speaking to a leader, but to a faith, a religion of denial. Logic had no language here. The truth lay gasping for air in the thick smoke, crushed beneath the weight of belief. I gathered the papers, unsure whether to protect them or bury them. When I looked up again, the meeting was over. Hitler had turned his back, already talking of wonder weapons and destiny. I walked out slowly, my footsteps echoing down the concrete hall. And in that moment, I understood. The war had ended. Not on the battlefield, but here, in this room, where truth had finally been strangled to death. It began as a rumor in the spring of 1943, reports of increased bombing sorties, new formations appearing over the North Sea, squadrons so large our radar screens blurred into solid light. By early 1944, the rumor had become thunder. From my office in Berlin, I read the daily air raid summaries. Cities that once existed only as names on maps, Regensburg, Schweinfurt, Bremen, were now footnotes of ash. The reports came faster than they could be filed. B-24 Liberators sighted over Brunswick, 400 aircraft in tight formation, 120 intercepted, 80 lost, targets destroyed. Numbers. Always numbers. They no longer belonged to production charts, now they were death statistics. I would trace my finger down the columns and think of the page that had started it all, the Willow Run report, dismissed, ridiculed, buried under laughter. The machine had come to life. In February 1944, the Allies launched what they called Big Week, a coordinated assault on the German aircraft industry. Thousands of bombers, many of them B-24 Liberators built at Willow Run, darkened the sky. The 8th Air Force struck by day, the RAF by night. Their targets were our factories, our fuel, our lungs, and they came without pause, wave after wave, until the very air seemed to hum with inevitability. The German people looked up and saw not clouds, but a ceiling of metal. One Luftwaffe general recorded in his diary, "Yesterday, 1,000 American bombers destroyed Leipzig. Reichsmarschall Goering still insists they cannot have built so many aircraft." Another wrote simply, "We are being buried by arithmetic." I remember reading those lines in a classified summary and feeling something close to pity, not for the generals, but for the blindness that had guided us here. Our fighter squadrons were brave, but bravery has a breaking point. For every Messerschmitt that rose, 10 Liberators crossed the channel. For every airfield rebuilt, another was erased. The sound was constant, an iron heartbeat overhead. I would stand by the window during alerts, watching the searchlights wander through the haze, and think, this is what inevitability sounds like. The Abwehr's radio intercepts confirmed what I already knew. The Willow Run plant alone was delivering over 650 bombers a month, running day and night in a rhythm that no nation in Europe could match. Reports from Japan called it a miracle of mass production. I called it something else, the revenge of numbers. Even Hitler could no longer deny the consequences. Fuel convoys stalled, rail lines shredded, factories silenced. The once proud Luftwaffe, the sword of the Reich, had become a collection of empty hangars and photographs. In the ruins, the echo of his words, "Machines don't win wars," came back like a curse. I no longer bothered sending updates. Truth by then had no audience. I kept the last version of the Willow Run report locked in my drawer, its edges worn from being handled too many times. Sometimes, late at night, I would take it out, read the figures once more, and feel a strange calm. Mathematics had outlived ideology. It required no faith, no speeches, no banners. It simply waited, patient and merciless. And when its moment came, it did what men could not. It brought judgment. One evening, as the sirens wailed again over Berlin, I stepped outside the Abwehr compound. The horizon burned red where the bombers had passed. Above me, the sky growled, a living creature made of engines and flame. I whispered to no one. So, this is how truth returns. Then I watched as another formation of liberators carved their way east, their silhouettes swallowing the stars. And I thought, not with bitterness, but with certainty. Mathematics had taken its revenge. They began to watch me long before the handcuffs came. You could feel it in the pauses between greetings, in the way conversations shortened when you entered a room. The SS had learned patience. They didn't need proof, only suspicion, and I had given them plenty. The Abwehr had become a sanctuary for men who still thought, and in the Third Reich, thought itself had become a crime. I used my position as camouflage, shielding those who still believed Germany could be saved from itself. One of them was a quiet pastor named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a man of faith, not politics, who carried courage the way others carried weapons. I helped keep him safe as long as I could, arranging transfers, hiding his correspondence. Each act felt small, but in a regime built on fear, small mercies were rebellions. After the July 20th, 1944 plot to kill Hitler failed, the net closed around us. The Gestapo tore through the Abwehr like a storm. Files vanished. Friends disappeared. Whispers turned into accusations. My own name surfaced again and again, carried on the breath of informants who needed someone else to die first. One morning, they came for me. No trial, no ceremony, just boots in the corridor and the click of steel. I was taken to Flossenburg, a place where silence replaced air. In the cell, time dissolved. There was no day or night, only the scraping of footsteps and the slow drip of water somewhere behind the wall. I kept a small notebook, writing when I could, though I knew it would never leave this place. I wrote not for history, but for clarity, for the few remaining hours in which I still belonged to myself. I thought often of March 17th, 1943, the day I first read the Willow Run report. I had seen the truth then, and I had carried it like a burning coal ever since. It had lit everything I touched, and in the end, it consumed me. Sometimes the guards looked at me with curiosity, as if trying to see the traitor beneath the wrinkles. But I was not a traitor. I had only refused to be blind. In the evenings, when the wind swept through the cracks of the cell, I would whisper a prayer I no longer believed in, more habit than hope. I knew I would not survive. The machine I had once served was now devouring its own engineers. On the final night, I heard the doors open, boots on stone, voices calling names. I closed the notebook, placed it on the cot, and straightened my collar. When they led me into the courtyard, the sky above was black and silent. No bombers, no thunder, only the quiet of an empire collapsing in slow motion. I did not speak. There was nothing left to defend. The truth had already done its work. They came for me at dawn. The footsteps in the corridor were soft, almost respectful, as if the guards, too, understood that the end no longer needed cruelty. I rose without being told. The cell was bare except for the notebook on the cot and the echo of my own breath. Outside, the air was sharp with frost. They led me into the courtyard of Flossenburg, where the snow was gray from the ash of the crematorium. The gallows stood against the pale morning, a wooden outline drawn over the ruins of an empire. I looked up at the sky, empty, silent, and thought of the other sky, the one that had once thundered with B-24 Liberators built by hands I was forbidden to respect. I remembered the paper I had first read in 1943, the Willow Run report, the numbers so simple, so merciless. 1 bomber an hour. 700 a month. Arithmetic had decided the war long before the generals did. That single sheet had weighed more than all the medals in Berlin. It had carried a truth no one wanted to bear, and because of that, it had become my death sentence. The officer in charge asked if I had any final words. I thought for a moment, then shook my head. What could I say that hadn't already been written in smoke across the skies of Germany? The executioner adjusted the wire. The cold bit into my skin. I closed my eyes and saw the endless factory lines, the sparks of welders, the rhythm of machines, men and women working not for vengeance, but for mastery over chaos. In their labor, I saw what my own nation had forgotten, that strength without reason is only destruction dressed as faith. As the rope tightened, my last thought was not of fear, but of clarity. I understood at last what had truly destroyed us. It was not the bombs, not the tanks, not the armies that crossed the Rhine. It was our blindness, our worship of pride over truth, of will over wisdom. The world went silent. Somewhere beyond the camp walls, dawn spread across the snow, pale and indifferent. And as the light touched the gallows, I knew this much was true. It was not war that killed Germany, but the pride that refused to see.